It was a nice Monday evening when I disrupted our tranquil existence with 3 words. I want him, my hubby. David stared at me as if I had spoken in a language he did not comprehend. His blue eyes, which are normally so loving, were suddenly filled with bewilderment and pain. I'd just expressed my greatest, darkest yearning, which had been nagging at me for months. I wanted to be with a black guy. David and I had been married for 10 years. We had a comfortable life in our suburban home, complete with a white picket fence and a golden retriever named Max. But beneath the surface of our seemingly perfect marriage, I felt a growing restlessness. It wasn't that I didn't love David. I did. But there was something missing, something I couldn't quite put into words until that fateful evening. What do you mean? You want him? David asked, his voice trembling with a mix of anger and disbelief. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves. I want to experience what it's like to be with a black man. Just once I need to know David. I need to know what it's like. The room fell silent, the weight of my words hanging heavily in the air. David stared at me, his face a mask of conflicting emotions. I could see the hurt in his eyes, but there was also something else, curiosity perhaps, or even a twisted sense of understanding. Are you serious? He finally asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, tears welling up in my eyes. I'm so sorry. David, I didn't mean to hurt you, but I can't keep this bottled up inside me anymore. I need to know. David exhaled deeply and ran his hand through his thinning hair. For a time, I expected him to shout or perhaps walk out the door, but he shocked me. Okay, he responded gently. If this is what you need, then I will assist you. I stared at him in shock. What do you mean? You'll help me? David looked away, his jaw tightening. I'll find someone for you, someone who can give you what you need. But after this, we never speak of it again. Understand? I nodded, my heart pounding in my chest. I couldn't believe what was happening. David, my loving, devoted husband, was willing to go to such lengths to fulfill my desires. But even as a part of me felt grateful, another part of me couldn't shake the feeling that we were crossing a line from which there was no return. Over the next few days, David kept his word. He began searching for someone who could fulfill my fantasy. It was surreal, watching him make calls and send messages, all in the name of satisfying my curiosity. I felt a strange mix of guilt and excitement, knowing that my life was about to change in ways I couldn't yet comprehend. Finally, one evening, David came home with a strange look on his face. I found someone, he said simply. My heart skipped a beat. Who is he? David hesitated, as if he was still unsure about what he was doing. His name is Kofi. He's exactly what you asked for. I've arranged for him to come over tomorrow night. I felt a surge of emotions, excitement, fear, guilt, and something else I couldn't quite name. Thank you, David, I whispered, though the words felt inadequate. David nodded, but there was a distance in his eyes that hadn't been there before. Just don't make me regret this. Okay, I promised him I wouldn't, but deep down, I knew that no matter what happened, our lives would never be the same again. To my amazing subscribers and gifters, thank you for your unwavering support. Your encouragement means the world to me and to my returning subscribers. I love you, and I'm so grateful to have you on this journey with me. The next evening, the air in our home was thick with tension. David had been quiet all day, his usual cheerful demeanor replaced by a stoic silence that made my stomach churn. I could tell he was struggling with what we were about to do, but he had made a promise, and David was a man of his word. I spent the day preparing, though I wasn't entirely sure what I was preparing for. I cleaned the house obsessively, as if a spotless living room could somehow make up for the chaos I was about to invite into our lives. I even cooked dinner, though neither of us had much of an appetite. When the doorbell rang at exactly 8 p.m., my heart nearly leaped out of my chest. David and I exchanged a glance, and for a moment I thought he might change his mind, but he didn't. He simply stood up, walked to the door, and opened it there. He was Kofi. He was taller than I had imagined, with broad shoulders and a confident stance that immediately commanded attention. His dark skin seemed to glow under the porch light, and his eyes, a deep shade of brown, locked onto mine with an intensity that made my knees weak. He was dressed casually in a fitted shirt and jeans, but there was an air of sophistication about him that made it clear he wasn't just some random guy David had found online. "You must be Kofi." David said, his voice tight. "That's me," Kofi replied, his voice smooth and deep. He extended a hand, and David shook it, though the gesture felt more like a formality than a greeting. "Come in," David said, stepping aside to let Kofi enter. As Kofi walked past me, I caught a whiff of his cologne, something warm and spicy that sent a shiver down my spine. He smiled at me, a slow, knowing smile that made my cheeks flush. "You must be the lady of the house," he said, his eyes lingering on me for a moment longer than necessary. "I am," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. David cleared his throat, breaking the tension. "Let's sit down," he said, gesturing toward the living room. We all took a seat, though the atmosphere was anything but comfortable. David sat in his usual armchair, his hands clasped tightly in his lap, while Kofi and I sat on opposite ends of the couch for few moments. No one spoke. Finally, Kofi broke the silence. "So David tells me you're interested in exploring something new," he said, his tone casual, as if we were discussing the weather. I glanced at David, who was staring at the floor, his jaw clenched. "Yes," I said, forcing myself to meet Jal's gaze. "I've never been with a black man before, and I want to know what it's like." Kofi nodded as if he'd heard this before. "I understand," he said, "and I'm here to make sure you have a good experience. But before we go any further, I need to make sure we're all on the same page." He looked at David, who finally looked up. "What do you mean?" David asked, his voice strained. "I mean," Kofi said, leaning forward slightly, "this is your wife, and I respect that. I'm not here to cause any problems in your marriage. I'm here to provide a service, and once that service is complete, I'll be on my way. No strings attached." David nodded, though I could see the conflict in his eyes. Understood. He said. Kofi turned back to me. "And you," he said, his voice softening. "I want to make sure you're comfortable with this. If at any point you want to stop, just say the word and we'll stop. No questions asked." I nodded, though my throat felt too dry to speak. Kofi leaned back, seemingly satisfied. "All right." Then he said, "Let's get down to business." David stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "I'll be in the other room," he said, his voice tight. I reached out to him, but he pulled away before I could touch him. "David," I began, but he shook his head. "Just do what you need to do," he said, before leaving the room. As I watched him depart, a knot formed in my throat. Part of me wanted to sprint after him and tell him that I had changed my mind and that this was not worth the anguish it was giving him. But another part of me, the one that had longed for this experience, held me back. Kofi cleared his throat, pulling my attention back to him. "Are you ready?" he asked, his voice gentle. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves. "Yes," I said, though my voice trembled. Kofi stood up and held out his hand. I hesitated for a moment before taking it, his warm, firm grip sending a jolt of electricity through me. He led me to the bedroom, where the air felt heavy with anticipation. As the door closed behind us, I felt a mix of excitement and guilt that I couldn't quite untangle. Kofi turned to me, his eyes searching mine. "Are you sure about this?" he asked. I nodded, though my heart was pounding. "I'm sure." And with that, Kofi leaned in, his lips brushing against mine in a kiss that was both gentle and commanding in that moment. All my doubts and fears melted away, replaced by a hunger I had never known before. But even as I lost myself in the experience, a small part of me couldn't help but wonder what David was doing in the other room and whether our marriage would ever recover from this. The room was dimly lit, the soft glow of the bedside lamp casting shadows on the walls. Kofi's presence filled the space, his confidence radiating like heat from a flame. I stood there, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure he could hear it. My hands trembled as I tried to steady my breathing, but the weight of what was about to happen pressed down on me like a storm cloud, ready to burst. Kofi took a step closer, his eyes never leaving mine. "Relax," he said, his voice low and soothing. "This is about you. Let me take care of you." His words were meant to comfort me, but they only made my nerves worse. I glanced at the closed door, wondering if David was still in the house. Was he sitting in the living room staring at the wall, trying to block out the sounds? Or had he left altogether, unable to bear the thought of what was happening just a few feet away? Kofi noticed my hesitation and gently cupped my face in his hands. "Hey," he said softly, "if you're not ready, we can stop. This is your call." I shook my head, forcing myself to focus on him. "No, I'm ready. I want this." He studied me for a moment, as if trying to gauge whether I was telling the truth. Then he nodded and leaned in, his lips brushing against mine. The kiss was slow and deliberate, his hands sliding down to my waist. As he pulled me closer, I felt a surge of warmth spread through me, my body responding to his touch in ways I hadn't expected. But even as I kissed him back, my mind was a whirlwind of emotions. Guilt, excitement, fear, and desire all battled for dominance, leaving me feeling both exhilarated and terrified. I had dreamed about this moment for so long, but now that it was here, I wasn't sure I was ready for it. Kofi seemed to sense my inner turmoil and pulled back slightly, his eyes searching mine. "You're thinking too much," he said with a small smile. "Just feel." I nodded, trying to push my thoughts aside. He was right. I needed to stop overthinking and just let myself experience this. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath, focusing on the sensation of his hands on my skin, the warmth of his body pressed against mine. He kissed me again, this time with more urgency, his hands roaming over my body as if memorizing every curve. I felt myself melting into him, my earlier doubts fading away as desire took over. His touch was electric, sending shivers down my spine as he explored me with a confidence that left me breathless. When he finally undressed me, I felt a mix of vulnerability and excitement. His eyes darkened as he took in the sight of me, and for a moment I felt like the most beautiful woman in the world. But then he began to undress, and I was struck by the sheer physicality of him. His body was unlike anything I had ever seen, strong, muscular, and perfectly proportioned. I couldn't help but stare, my mouth going dry. As I took him in, he noticed my reaction and chuckled softly, like what you see. He asked, his voice teasing. I nodded, unable to form words. He stepped closer, his hands resting on my hips as he leaned down to kiss me again. This time, there was no hesitation, no doubt. I wanted him, and I was ready to take that final step. When he finally entered me, I gasped, the sensation overwhelming. It was different from anything I had ever experienced, deeper, more intense, and utterly consuming. I clung to him, my nails digging into his back as he moved with a rhythm that left me breathless. Every touch, every movement was designed to bring me pleasure, and I felt myself losing control in ways I hadn't thought possible. But even as my body responded to him, my mind couldn't fully let go. Images of David kept flashing in my head, his hurt and confusion etched into my memory. I tried to push them away to focus on the moment, but they lingered like a shadow, casting a pall over what should have been a purely pleasurable experience. Kofi seemed to sense my distraction and slowed down his eyes, locking onto mine. "Stay with me," he said, his voice firm but gentle. "This is your moment. Don't let anything take it away from you." I nodded, forcing myself to focus on him. He was right. This was my moment, and I needed to embrace it fully. I closed my eyes and let myself feel, every sensation magnified as I gave myself over to the experience. When it was over, I lay there, my body trembling as I tried to process what had just happened. Kofi stayed beside me, his hand resting lightly on my stomach as we both caught our breath. For a few moments, there was silence. The only sound was the soft hum of the air conditioner. "How do you feel?" he asked after a while, his voice breaking the quiet. I thought about it for a moment before answering. "I don't know." I admitted it was incredible, but I also feel the guilty. He nodded as if he had expected that that's normal. He said, "What you're feeling is complicated, and it's okay to take your time to process it." I turned to look at him. Surprised by his understanding, "You're not upset." He shook his head. "This is what I do. I help people explore their desires, but I also know that it's not always easy. You're not the first person to feel this way, and you won't be the last." His words were comforting, but they didn't completely ease the knots of guilt in my stomach. I knew that what I had done would have consequences, and I wasn't sure I was ready to face them. Kofi sat up and began to get dressed, his movements calm and unhurried. "I'll let you get some rest," he said when he was done. "If you need anything, just let me know." I nodded, watching. As he walked to the door, he paused before opening it, turning back to look at me. "Take care of yourself," he said softly. "And remember, this doesn't define you." With that, he was gone, leaving me alone with my thoughts. I lay there for a long time, staring at the ceiling as I tried to make sense of everything. The experience had been everything I had imagined and more, but it had also left me feeling hollow, as if I had lost a part of myself in the process. And as I finally drifted off to sleep, I couldn't shake the feeling that my life and my marriage would never be the same again if you're still with me till this moment. Thank you. Because of you, I can create more videos. You're incredible. Support your encouragement keeps me going. The morning after was quiet, too quiet. The house felt like a tomb, the air heavy with unspoken words and unresolved tension. I woke up alone in the bed, the sheets still rumpled from the night before. For a moment, I lay there staring at the ceiling, trying to piece together the fragments of my thoughts. The memories of the previous night came flooding back, and with them, a wave of guilt that threatened to drown me. I got up slowly, my body still aching in places I hard known could ache. I pulled on a robe and padded to the bathroom, avoiding my reflection in the mirror. I didn't want to see the woman staring back at me, the woman who had betrayed her husband in the most intimate way possible. When I finally ventured out of the bedroom, I found David sitting at the kitchen table, a cup of coffee in front of him. He looked up when I walked in, his expression unreadable for a long moment. We just stared at each other, the silence between us deafening good morning. I said, finally, my voice barely above a whisper. David didn't respond right away. He just looked at me, his blue eyes cold and distant. When he finally spoke, his voice was flat, devoid of emotion. "Did you get what you wanted?" The question hit me like a punch to the gut. I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came out. What could? I say that it had been everything I had imagined and more, that I had enjoyed it, even as it tore me apart. Inside that, I was sorry, but I wasn't sure if I regretted it. David didn't wait for an answer. He stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "I need some air," he said, grabbing his keys from the counter. "David, wait." I started, but he was already out the door before I could finish. I stood there frozen as the sound of his car engine roared to life and then faded into the distance. The house felt even emptier without him, the silence pressing down on me like a weight I sank into a chair, my legs suddenly too weak to hold me up. The rest of the day passed in a blur. I tried to keep myself busy, cleaning the house and doing laundry, but my mind kept drifting back to the night before. I couldn't stop thinking about Kofi, his touch, his voice, the way he had made me feel. But those thoughts were always followed by a pang of guilt. A reminder of what I had done to David. When David finally returned that evening, the tension in the house was palpable. He didn't say a word as he walked in, just went straight to the living room and turned on the TV. I hovered in the doorway, unsure of what to do. "David," I said, finally, my voice trembling, "can we talk?" He didn't look at me. "What's that a talk about?" I need to know how you're feeling," I said. Taking a tentative step into the room, David finally turned to look at me, his eyes blazing with anger. "How I'm feeling? How do you think I'm feeling?" "Aisha, I just helped my wife sleep with another man. How the hell do you think I'm feeling?" I flinched at the venom in his voice. "I'm sorry," I said, tears welling up in my eyes. "I never meant to hurt you, but you did." David snapped. "You hurt me! Aisha, you hurt us! And for what, some fantasy? Some curiosity? Was it worth it?" I didn't have an answer for him. The truth was, I didn't know if it had been worth it. The experience had been everything I had imagined, but it had come at a cost. A cost. I wasn't sure I was willing to pay. David stood up, his fists clenched at his sides. "I can't do this," he said, his voice breaking. "I can't just pretend like everything's okay. I need some space. Space." I repeated, my heart sinking. "What do you mean?" I'm leaving," David said, his tone final. "I'm going to stay at a hotel for a few days. I need time to think." "David, please." I begged, tears streaming down my face. "Don't go. We can work through this." But he was already walking away, grabbing his suitcase from the closet and throwing clothes into it. I stood there helpless as he packed his things and headed for the door. "David," I said one last time, my voice barely above a whisper. He paused, his hand on the doorknob, but he didn't turn around. "I'll call you," he said, his voice heavy with emotion. And then he was gone, the door slamming shut behind him. I sank to the floor, sobbing uncontrollably. The weight of what I had done crashed down on me, leaving me feeling hollow. And the days that followed David's departure were the loneliest of my life. The house, once filled with warmth and laughter, now felt like a prison. Every room reminded me of him, the couch where we used to watch movies together, the kitchen table where we shared meals, the bed where we had slept side by side for 10 years. Now it was all empty, silent, and cold. I tried to keep myself busy, throwing myself into work and household chores, but nothing could distract me from the gnawing guilt that had taken up permanent residence in my chest. I replayed the night with Kofi over and over in my head, trying to make sense of it. Had it been worth? It had. I really needed to know what it was like to be with someone else, even if it meant destroying my marriage. The answer, I realized, was no. It hadn't been worth it, not even close. A week after David left, I finally worked up the courage to call him my hands. Shook as I dialed his number, and my heart pounded as I waited for him to pick up. When he finally answered, his voice was cold and distant. "Hello? David?" I said, my voice trembling. "It's me." There was a long pause before he responded. "What do you want?" "Aisha, I just wanted to see how you're doing," I said, though the words felt inadequate. David sighed heavily. "I'm fine," he said, though his tone suggested otherwise. "I've been doing a lot of thinking, me too," I said quickly. "David, I'm so sorry. I never meant to hurt you. I was selfish and I made a terrible mistake, but I love you and I want to fix this. Please just come home so we can talk." There was another long pause, and for a moment I thought he might hang up. But then he spoke, his voice heavy with emotion. "Sa, I don't know if I can come back what you did. It changed everything. I don't know if I can ever look at you the same way again." His words hit me like a punch to the gut. I had known this was a possibility, but hearing him say it out loud made it all too real. Tears streamed down my face as I struggled to find the right words. "David, please," I begged. "I know I messed up, but we've been through so much together. We can get through this too. I'll do whatever it takes to make it right." David was silent for so long that I thought he might have hung up, but then he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "I need more time. Aisha, I don't know if I can forgive you, but I need time to figure things out." I nodded, even though he couldn't see me. "Okay," I said, my voice breaking. "Take all the time you need, just please don't give up on us." He didn't respond, and after a moment, the line went dead. I sat there, clutching the phone to my chest as sobs racked my body. I had never felt so alone in my life. The weeks turned into months, and David and I drifted further apart. We spoke occasionally, but the conversations were stilted and awkward, filled with unspoken pain and regret. I tried to give him the space he needed, but it was hard. I missed him. His laugh, his grin, and the way he used to hug me at night. I missed the life we had created together and hated myself for letting it all go. One evening, I sat alone in my living room. I found myself thinking about Kofi. I hadn't heard from him since that night, which I was thankful about. He had been a means to an end, a way for me to explore a fantasy, but he had also been the catalyst for the destruction of my marriage. I couldn't blame him. He had done exactly what I had asked him to do. The blame lay squarely on my shoulders. I thought about what Kofi had said to me that night. "This doesn't define you." At the time, I hadn't understood what he meant, but now I did. What I had done was a mistake, but it didn't have to be the end of me. I could learn from it, grow from it, and hopefully one day forgive myself for it. But forgiving myself was easier said than done. Every night, as I lay in bed alone, I was haunted by the choices I had made. I wondered if David would ever come back, or if our marriage was truly over. I wondered if I would ever be able to move on, or if I would be stuck in this limbo of guilt and regret forever. One day I received a letter in the mail. It was from David. My hands shook as I opened it, my heart pounding in my chest. The letter was short, but the words cut deep. "Aisha, I've done a lot of thinking over tea. The past few months, and I've come to a decision. I can't come back what happened between us. It's something I can't get past. I'll always care about you, but I don't think we can fix this. I'm filing for divorce. I'm sorry. David." I read the letter over and over, the words, blurring as tears filled my eyes. It was over my marriage, my life with David. Everything we had built together, it was all gone, and it was all my fault. I sat there for a long time, the letter clutched in my hands as the weight of my regret settled over me. I had gotten what I wanted, but in the process, I had lost everything that truly mattered. The choices we make have repercussions, and sometimes what we think we desire might cost us what we really need. Love, trust, and respect are the basis of all relationships. Once shattered, they are difficult to mend before pursuing a transient goal. Ask yourself, is it worth the money? Sometimes the greatest wisdom is understanding when to let go of curiosity and when to cling on to what genuinely important. Thank you for taking part in this story. Please subscribe and stay with us.